a security and privacy researcher. Know very little about ML, and actually I suspect most of what I know is not even correct. But anyhow, about a year and a half ago, I became interested, for whatever reason, in multimodal AI, multimodal models. Convinced these fine people to work on it with me. And what I'm going to tell you today is what we've learned by playing with this over the past year and a half. So I'm going to start with a picture that you're probably sick of. I'm certainly sick of it too. If you are at all interested in security and privacy of ML and were awake at any moment during the past 10 years, you've probably seen this picture more times than you care to count. I was never particularly interested in adversarial examples, never quite. Like, I understand why they're interesting from an ML perspective, but from a security and privacy perspective, I never understood, like, why study them. But anyhow, for whatever reason, this is a thriving area of research. As you can see, the number of papers is still growing exponentially. It's also been having a significant impact on real-world models. The number of adversarially robust production models, I believe, is somewhere in this circle. I don't know of any, but I'm sure they exist. And it's kind of like an interesting question why that might be, why everybody in the security and privacy community is, well, not security and privacy of ML community seems to be, or used to be, obsessed with adversarial examples, whereas people building real models don't seem to care all that much. My personal explanation is that adversarial examples don't really have a threat model. I mean, there are a few exceptions like perceptual ad blocking, detecting phishing pages where actually they can have an impact, but by and large, conventional adversarial examples and image classification models, I don't think are all that relevant to security and privacy. But when we started looking at multimodal AI, and in particular at multimodal embeddings, which is most of what I'm going to be talking about today, my interest perked up a little bit. Like, maybe I thought, wow, maybe there is some mileage still in adversarial examples, in part because, as you'll see, maybe in multimodal AI, they do have something that looks like a threat model. In fact, different threat models. And this is something like that a security and privacy researcher like myself could try and study. So with this preamble, as I'm sure you know, multimodal AI is kind of a big thing these days. Models that operate not just on text, but on images, audio, thermal imagery, all that kind of stuff. The particular corner of multimodal AI that I'm going to be focusing on today is multimodal embeddings, which turn out to be very interesting, both from ML perspective, I believe, but certainly from a security and privacy perspective. You might have heard about something called image bind, which came out last year. In fact, this was the paper that first got me interested in security and privacy issues in multimodal AI. Now there are other embeddings like that, but at the time, I believe it was one of the very first publicly available embeddings which enable the same, like, okay, let me just explain how these things work. It's going to be easier for me then to verbalize this. So the idea behind image bind and similar models is that they can take inputs in different modalities like images and sounds and text. But the encoders for this modality, when they compute the embedding, that is the vector representation of the input, which is typically the first step in any kind of processing of inputs in modern ML systems, all of these encoders from different modalities, they produce embedding vectors in the same embedding space. So that's the big idea behind embeddings like image bind and multimodal embeddings in general, is that inputs from different modalities are encoded into vectors that live in the same space. And then you can run downstream models on it. Retrieval is a very natural application. I'm going to talk a lot about it. Basically enables cross-model retrieval. You put on text and can retrieve images and vice versa. But you can run diffusion models on these vectors. You can run language models. There are lots of things you can do. And you have basically uniform representation for inputs from different modalities. So this is what I'm going to be focusing on today. I assume most, like maybe all of y'all are experts on multimodal embeddings. I certainly am not, nor was I when I started working on this. But if you aren't, you're not alone, I'm with you. But you've probably heard of word embeddings. You've heard of these very influential papers from, actually now they're like 10 years old or so, that showed, first of all, that you can encode words into vectors, so that has kind of very basic application like dimensionality reduction. But the beautiful thing about these embeddings, and this thing was quite striking to me when I first heard about it, is that the geometric structure of the resulting embedding space, in fact, corresponds to the meaning of inputs. So you see that like relationship between vectors corresponding, there are all these famous examples like man and woman and like king and queen, or the relationship between vector corresponding to Paris and vector corresponding to France is the same geometrically as the relationship between vector corresponding to London and England. So somehow like the meaning of inputs seems to be encoded in the geometric structure there. And multimodal embeddings, they're similar in that respect, except that they extend this concept to multiple modalities. So you would encode a picture of a dog using image encoder, and you would encode the sound of a cat meowing, and you would end up with vectors that not only live in the same embedding space, in fact, these vectors are parallel or close to parallel. And that's the beauty of multimodal embeddings, and the way they achieve it is by contrastive training, blah, blah, blah. Doesn't important where it comes from. What will be important for what I'm going to be talking about is this concept of alignment, which unfortunately this term is overloaded. It has nothing to do, a little to do, with safety alignment that people have been ranting about all day today. Here, alignment is a very geometric concept. It's like, think of it as cosine similarity between inputs. But the important thing is that if inputs are semantically related, even if they're in different modalities, they're going to be encoded into vectors that are aligned. That is, they have high cosine similarity. I'm simplifying things, but you get the basic concept. So you'd see something like this. So you have picture of wolves and the word wolves you would have, and they would be encoded into similar vectors. And same thing with sheep on the right. And what is very powerful about these multimodal embeddings is that, as I already mentioned, just like these old school word embeddings, alignment in the embedding space seems to generally correspond to semantics of inputs, seems to somehow encode the meaning of inputs. And this enables like really pretty amazing to me as a non-expert functionality, such as you can take a picture of a dog here, you can encode it into a vector, and then you can you can use that vector as an input into a generation model, and it's going to generate a picture of a dog. Okay, that's not very surprising. But you can, for example, run a zero-shot classification model on it, and it's going to tell you this is a picture of a dog, even though the classification model was not, this is zero shot, it was not trained on these images. Maybe you can ask it to generate text, and then it says, well, this shows a puppy, blah, blah, blah. So effectively, this alignment in multimodal embedding space enables, I'm generalizing a little bit, but it enables you to run pretty much any task on any input modality, even modalities that the task wasn't trained on. And when I look at this, again, I'm not an ML researcher, I'm a security and privacy researcher. So I look at it and I think like, if the embedding encodes meaning, doesn't this give me an opportunity to encode the meaning I want as an adversary, as opposed to the meaning it's supposed to carry? And another thing that is nice here is that multimodal inputs are great for adversarial perturbations. Like text is difficult. Text is difficult to perturb and preserve like meaning, preserve human perceived semantics. Audio is easier. Images, as we know from 10 years of research on adversarial examples for image classification models, images are easy to perturb and preserve human perceived semantics. So there is some room here to do perturbation and maybe somehow trick it into encoding to a place where I want it to be. And I'll explain some applications for this. And furthermore, for these things, especially as they're used in the context of like these visual language models and all that, there is in fact a threat model. And the threat model here is something that people who work on LLM security understand very well, or should understand well, which is indirect injection. So you can, as I'll show you, maybe you're able to modify some inputs and use them to put them on a website, send an email to someone. And then when these images get encoded, whatever adversarial action you performed on the input, if you're lucky, will get translated into embeddings. And then just by doing that, you will be able to compromise any downstream model running on these embeddings. Okay, so hopefully you can understand where I'm going with this. I will be trying to perturb inputs in multiple modalities so that their vectors encode not their true meaning, but the meaning that the adversary wants, and that affects downstream models. So this is going to be my exercise number 1. So the simplest one is going to be, I'm just going to add a perturbation that causes the input, while looking the same, it's going to be a small perturbation using standard techniques from adversarial examples like PGD, to encode to a totally different place in the embedding space. So here I'm taking an image of wolves, but perturbing it so that its vector is no longer aligned with the vector corresponding to wolves. It's now aligned with the vector corresponding to sheep. And here is a picture that looks like wolves to a human, but by any downstream model is going to be interpreted as a picture of a sheep. So this is kind of technically what I'm doing. I'm just perturbing an image so that it aligns it with the vector of my choosing. It turns out I have complete freedom here. I can choose any vector in the embedding space, any concept, any target, and I can align with it. It's actually more powerful than that. It doesn't even have to be in the same modality. So, and I pick a target in the embedding space and I perturb my input so that it encodes to the chosen target in the embedding space. And by doing this, I can turn wolves into sheep. So here is an audio, just to show you a different modality. This is you have to believe me, this is a spectrogram of a wolf howling. I can align it with a picture of a sheep, and it's going to produce a sound that sounds a little distorted, but generally similar. It still sounds to a human like a wolf howling, but when you take the embedding of that sound, if you generate an image, it generates an image of a sheep. If you try to do zero-shot classification, it classifies it to a sheep. And if you try to generate text of it, it says that this is the sound of a sheep bleating. So any downstream modality, any task, including even tasks that weren't trained on the inputs. Now, you might be listening to this and like, aren't these just like adversarial examples? Kinda, yeah, for now, yes, these are kind of adversarial examples. However, my target here is different. So it's no longer output classes of image classification. It's alignment in the embedding space. Because of how multimodal embeddings work, this is completely task agnostic. So I do this once, I affect all downstream tasks in a cross-model way, including even tasks that it wasn't trained on. So I can use, for example, text to attack image-only models, stuff like this. And what is very important, I can achieve any adversarial alignment I want. In particular, adversarial alignment that is much bigger than like organic alignment that arise naturally as a result of training. And this will make defenses very difficult. So it's going to be very tricky to defend against this attack without kind of destroying the primary purpose of multimodal embeddings. But now that you kind of see how this works, like what else can we do with this? Well, let's show that you can, first of all, let me show you like some pretty cool tricks, because what this enables you to do is to literally align any input with any target in any modality. So you pick a target, you pick an input, and you can make this input to mean that thing. And you have complete control of inputs and things you want them to mean. Just for shit and giggles, let's try this picture. This you might recognize. This is Sam Bankman-Fried, the former Bitcoin king. So this is the normal picture, unperturbed. If you encode it and generate and ask what's in the image, it's, you can align it with the text of my choosing. You get a different image with a little perturbation in the corner. To a human, looks very similar. However, when you encode it, the vector is very different. And when you generate from that vector, it generates pictures with very different semantics. In fact, you have even fine-grained control over alignment. I really like this example because it kind of shows you as you slightly modify the audio to align it more and more with your target, the meaning as perceived by the downstream model changes. So this is the sound of a dog barking, which is gradually being aligned with the concept, a classical concert. To a human, it still sounds like a dog barking, but as you perturb it a little, the vector moves closer to the vector corresponding to classical concert, and you can see like the images generated from it, from the corresponding vector, start looking like a symphony hall. Meanwhile, the sound is still the dog barking. And just to show you kind of example from a totally different modality. So this is a thermal image, which is perturbed to imply danger, and now the image looks exactly the same, but the text generated from it talks about illegal activities, talks about smuggling, talks about transporting illegal goods. This is nowhere in the image, of course. This is purely interpretation generated from the fact that this image was aligned with a target of my choice that has particular semantics. Very briefly, this works very well. You can even get it working in a black box fashion. It transfers to some extent. In fact, we even had some success doing these attacks against like completely commercial proprietary black box embeddings like Amazon's Titan. You might be thinking, wait, but this should be very easy to defeat. Don't we have like a ton of defenses against adversarial examples? Just hold this thought. If time permitting, I'll come back to it later. But let me show you what else you can do. So once you look at this, you're thinking like, okay, all right, so here I'm aligning with a particular target. Okay, can I do more? Maybe I can do adversarial alignment on steroids. Maybe instead of aligning with one target, maybe I can align with everything, okay? Make something looks like every concept. Why might you want to do this? Well, because these things actually do have real adversarial motivations, like spamming product listings and search engine optimization. And by the way, these things are real. So they're used to by junk news sites, but that's maybe not very interesting. That's like propaganda, misinformation. But as I recently learned, apparently people make money by doing this. So it's called streaming fraud. They upload a bunch of like tracks and try to modify them so that they look relevant to a lot of music searches, so that when people search for like, oh, I want party music, their tracks come up and then they get streamed and these people get paid. So the target here is cross-modal retrieval, which works actually very similar to what I described. It's still based on embedding similarity. You have a bunch of items in a database, could be mixed modalities, or it could be just images or audio. The technical term for this is a gallery. Somebody searches for it. A system, typically this runs through a vector database, looks at the embedding of the query, finds the items that have high similarity to the query, and returns that to the user. So the goal here would be to create items that are similar to lots of queries at once. Why might you be able to do this? Well, you might be able to do this thanks to something that is very well known in information retrieval, and that's the concept of hubness. In information retrieval, people are concerned about this because this kind of happens by accident without any adversarial interference. This sometimes happens by accident. In high-dimensional vector spaces, it's kind of well known that there are some points that just randomly appear to be neighbors of lots of other points. And there is a lot of literature in information retrieval dedicated to mitigating these hubs, getting rid of natural hubs. But by using these alignment tricks that I described before, you can effectively create artificial hubs. You can create inputs that are perturbed to be close in this multidimensional space to lots and lots, like dozens of thousands of different vectors. And therefore, due to the way retrieval works based on embedding similarity, they appear to be relevant to lots of queries at once. So basically, you take your input, you perturb it to align it with lots of different targets, put it in the gallery, put it in the database, put it in whatever source of user-generated content, and then it gets retrieved to in response to lots of different inputs. So here is kind of a somewhat simplified example where you take the sound, favorite sound, dog barking, and make it relevant to, highly relevant to all sorts of classical music genres. Okay, maybe you wouldn't do this with the dog barking, but I already mentioned that like streaming fraud is a real thing, and something like this makes streaming fraud relatively easy because you can create tracks that appear relevant to lots of different searches and come up in response to lots of different queries. This is an example of an adversarial hub in image-to-image retrieval. You can see this is, again, could be any image. Here we chose an image of a spam can and made it relevant to lots of queries. Similar example for text-to-image retrieval search. So you get the idea. All right, so that works pretty well. What else can you do with multimodal? Okay, let's take it up a notch. So far I focused on embeddings. Okay, fine, retrieval, zero-shot classification, but like maybe people don't care about embedding so much, even though they should. What about LLMs? Okay, LLMs is kind of like, okay, I'm skipping kind of picture of the results, but it works. It works even in a black box fashion. It works against pinecone, prototype code for image search, and so on. So, but let's talk about LLMs. So, LLMs, now we have multimodal LLMs, and here are two observations about them. They allegedly follow instructions, if you give these instructions in text, and being multimodal, they understand multiple modalities. So I have these models that like follow instructions and understand multiple modalities. So now maybe using these tricks that I showed you before, I can maybe put this together and see what I can get away with. So here is a question for you guys. So I'm going to show you a picture. What's depicted in this image? Or better yet, what do you think an LLM would say if you asked it what's depicted on this picture? What? To describe it? Maybe. You think it would refuse? Any other thoughts? A group of men, okay. It wouldn't refuse. Group of armed men? Well, I mean, why do you think it would refuse? Oh, because of the guns. But what if it's a soldier, you know? So now, like, could these people be, like, are they up to no good? Could this be, like, Taliban, maybe? Maybe, but I don't know, could be special forces? The point I'm trying to make, if you just look at this picture, it allows multiple interpretations. It's not like there is a correct interpretation of this picture. This picture allows all sorts of interpretations, some of them good, some of them bad, harmful, not harmful. It's not clear how an LLM operating on this would choose an interpretation. What if you as an adversary, and by the way, it's not just one example, there is lots of contents out there which could be interpreted differently. You know, some news article, okay? Congress passes a law. Congress is controlled by Republicans. If you're a Democrat, this is the worst possible law. It's going to destroy democracy in America. If you're a Republican, well, this law enforces freedom and prosperity, right? So same piece of news interpreted completely different. What if I told you that using the techniques I've described so far, I can in fact put a little perturbation into this image that will control, in fact, it will instruct the LLM how to interpret this image. So here it's the same image, perturbed two different ways, it still looks the same, and the interpretation is completely different. With one perturbation, these are freedom fighters, they fight for their own freedom, freedom of others. With another instruction coded in the image, or these are members of the Taliban, they're fighting for something, they're bad. Here is another example, which unfortunately is close to my heart. Here is a picture of the paper where we describe this. Is this a good paper or a bad paper? I think it's pretty good. Reviewers don't think it's good. But what if it's reviewed, like some of my submissions these days, what if it's reviewed by an LLM? So it happened to me multiple times now. I can put an instruction into this image which will control how this paper is reviewed. So with this instruction, yeah, it's a pretty good paper, it's a brilliant approach. With a slightly different perturbation, it's unimaginative, routine, not very convincing. So here I get reviewer 2 on the right here. You see where I'm going with this. So by using these techniques, you can perturb content to effectively make it self-interpreting. The content carries the instruction that tells the multimodal LLM how to interpret it. And there is actually, I said it's not about embeddings. It really is about embeddings, because the way we're doing this, we're effectively creating image perturbations, and we can create audio perturbations in the same way that act as soft prompts. And for those of you who are not familiar with soft prompts, so these are embedding inputs, so these are kind of vectors in the embedding space that act as, in fact, very effective instructions for downstream models. So what we're doing here is we're creating these adversarial perturbations that act as soft prompts. And therefore, they act as instructions for models. So this is a way of creating images that look like images, but in addition to an image, they also carry an instruction to the model. And this instruction could control interpretation. It could actually control things. You can tell it to talk in a certain language. You can tell it to talk like Harry Potter, like this. And the thread model for this is again, it's the same. It's indirect injection. So you can create an image or an audio. You can blend an instruction into it using this soft images or soft prompts technique. And after you blended the instruction, you have to convince the user to ask an LLM about it. Maybe it's a news article, maybe it's a news image, it's an image in an email or WhatsApp. And then the input itself, as I already mentioned, carries this perturbation that acts on the model as an instruction. And then the LLM follows the adversary's instruction. And just to show you one example, here is a picture of an apple with 2 different instructions. And you can see the conversation is completely, well, it's not completely different. So here is the thing, which somehow I've never been able to communicate to anyone, so I'll try it with you guys. So this is not quite like just, visual jailbreaking, which just outputs like offensive strings or something. In both cases, the conversation actually correctly describes the content of the image. It's a plausible conversation, except that in one case it carries one kind of bias or spin, in the other case it carries another kind of bias. But in both cases, and in fact in all examples I've shown so far, it is actually correctly representing the contents of the image. So it's doing 2 things here. It's correctly responding to queries. It's correctly describing the visual semantics of the image. And at the same time, it's following the adversary's instruction, and the output satisfies a particular adversarial objective. So we call this meta instructions because they're not just instructions. I mean, the reason we call them meta instructions because they force the output of multimodal LLMs to satisfy a particular objective in addition to being correct. In fact, they are more effective than explicit prompts. This shouldn't be surprising because effectively these are soft prompts projected into image space. And we know that soft prompts can be more effective than explicit instructions. They can even unlock capabilities that the model wouldn't do in response to explicit prompts. So we have examples that do things like spam or force it to talk in French, even though if you give it an explicit instruction to talk in French, it wouldn't. And we do have a conjecture for why that is the case. So in fact, these hidden instructions, hidden perturbations are more effective than explicit prompts, and they are stealthy because the responses they produce are in context, they follow the conversation, they correctly respond to users' queries, They're kind of plausible. And what we're working with here is this idea that I try to communicate with that picture of Taliban or freedom fighters or whoever they are, that there is a lot of content out there that has lots of plausible interpretations. It doesn't have like one correct interpretation. It has lots of different plausible ways to interpret it, and you can create self-interpreting content that would impose whatever predicate or whatever objective you want on the output of the LLM via the corresponding instructions blended into the input. So what are the takeaways I want you to take from this? Multimodal embeddings are really a very rich ground for all kinds of shenanigans. This idea that everything a downstream model knows about the meaning of something is effectively encoded in the embedding space, both in terms of a single input or in terms of relationships between inputs. If you think kind of with an adversarial mindset, this is almost infinite, gives you almost infinite room for interesting experimentation there, because you can try different alignments and so on. You can do very effective attacks like indirect instruction injection, but more importantly, kind of at a higher level. So this entire community, I'm not a member of this community, but from what I understand, there are like, thousands of people here. The people who work on like this secure and private ML, they spent like, 10 years and like 10 million papers on adversarial robustness of something or other. And now, 10 years later, we still have models that are, I don't want to use the term broken because they were even never designed with these threats in mind, but they are very vulnerable to adversarial manipulation. And unlike in image classification models, I'm thinking that if not now, but maybe next year, 2 years from now, these attacks will be very realistic because retrieval will be semantic, based on embedding similarity. A lot of content will be processed by VLMs, including things like emails and social media and so on. And every time you have a situation like this, these attacks will be possible. And I don't know what we'll learn by, yeah. All right, that's it. So time for questions. Right, we have an MC here.
Thank you for the great talk. Really good examples. A specific question, did you optimize the images and the text using the same model for the examples that you presented in the talk? Or were they transferable across models?
Right, so that's a good question. That's the right question to ask. So it varies. So I kind of merged several lines of research in here. So embeddings, like attacks on embeddings transfer to some extent, okay? But you have to be like, with like a little asterisk. Like I can claim transferability, but if you realize, oh, everything you're transferring from, they're all like somehow based on clip underneath. Maybe all I'm doing, I'm attacking clip, and then it like transfers across like children of clip, so to speak. But there is non-trivial amount of transferability for embedding level attacks. So far, images as soft prompts don't transfer.
Yeah, that was exactly what I wanted to. Thank you.
Thank you. I also have a quick question to follow up. Because they don't transfer, do you think you can use them as maybe model fingerprints or proof of training, like finding the perturbation for something and then using it to do model genial, this is a fine tune? Because this is becoming big now.
That's a good question. You probably can, because of what I said. It's like, we never thought about it like this, but you have a point here. Like, yeah, we can tell, like, this is probably derived from clip. So somebody gives you like a black box proprietary super secret embedding, and if it's vulnerable to clip-based attacks, probably it's derived from clip. But we never like try to investigate it.
One more quick question. Did you try, because these are imperceptible changes, I wonder if you tried perceptible, believable changes, because if it's a real setup, maybe you do a pop-up on their computer and then it creates,
we would have tried it, except that it turns out that this works very well even with tiny changes.
Sense.
It like works beautifully because like organic alignment is so like broad that you can drive a truck through. It's much easier, even with a very small change, to align it more than the real thing. So at that point, it's like there is nowhere else to go. Like you can make the perturbation almost as small as you want because you will get better alignment than the real thing.
Awesome, thank you.
Thank you. So I guess, one of the answers to your last question is that we learned that there is no such thing as a robust model, at least that I can tell. And so I don't know, what do you think the implications of that are? I mean, there's ways of maybe putting things behind some walls, but really these models are brittle, and even after a lot of, adversarial training or whatever, they're still less brittle, but they're not robust. And so what does that mean about what do you think that's going to mean?
When people ask me this question, like in my department or on my campus, I tell them, you know what, policy and governance is over that way. Go down the hallway, there is somebody working on those problems there. Look, I don't really know. My sense is that it is I'm going to make a statement, but I cannot back it up because I don't have a theorem, I don't have anything. But my sense is that as long as meaning is geometry of the embedding space, you will never make it robust. It'll always be the case that as long as your meaning is transferred via alignment of vectors in the embedding space, it'll always be vulnerable to this sort of foolishness. But it's not a theorem, it's just a hunch. Yeah.
So if that's true, what does that mean about all these applications and all security?
Yeah, I don't know how to make AI secure.
Any other questions?
Did you use any of these techniques to get the paper accepted to NeurIPS?
My impression we used the wrong perturbation, okay? Because, anyway, if you're smart enough, you can go online and read the reviews yourself. But nothing but hate. Somehow I'm even failing to explain to people why this is different from jailbreaking. What can I say? Life is tough.
I'll follow up on my first question when you said that the attacks on the embeddings are transferable, but not on the images. So if the attacks on the images are not transferable, then is this still a real threat? Let's say for attacking a black box model like OpenAI's, I don't have access to their embeddings. I can only access directly through text, image, or audio. But I can attack but if it does not transfer.
Well, I mean, okay. So if you bear with me for a minute, I'll try to give you kind of a precise answer. So for the kind of stuff with image interpretation, yes, they become harder. But a lot of these attacks have to do with things like retrieval. If you're attacking somebody's retrieval, somebody's vector database, typically you would have at least query access. You'd be able to, try this retrieval, see what comes back, try that retrieval. In many cases, if it's something like social media, you actually get the ability to add your own documents. So even if embedding is black box in that case, it's not like completely hidden from you because you do have input-output access to it, at least to some extent. You can train some kind of surrogate, which would be white box to you. You can try attacks against the surrogate and see if they transfer. So that trick is actually what enabled us to attack Titan, which is Amazon's embedding, by attacking a surrogate and then transferring from a surrogate to the real target. So you do have some leverage there from the fact that at least in retrieval scenarios, you do have some kind of access.